right now. Very good. Captain Bocek watched his crew snap to, and as the bright blue and gold flag of Amity rose, he saw the Port Royal come up alongside her. She was a monster compared to the schooners that his little three-ship convoy was running. However, the Roxana, Kira, and Natalia were not unarmed. So, I'm getting my slow down mooring. I do have a throttle here. Let's see. Captain Bocek watched his crew snap to as the bright blue and gold flag of Amity rose. He saw the Port Royal come up alongside her. She was a monster compared to the schooners that his little three-ship convoy was running. However, the Roxana, Kira, and Natalia were not unarmed. Being designed to run from fights, not to stay in them, each ship had 3 guns on each side. He was encouraged by the presence of the British fleet, he was encouraged by the presence of the British fleet. Perhaps they would run alongside them for a day. The captain looked at the British ship and saw something odd. The ship's name on her side identified her as the Jolly Roger, not the Port Royal. He felt a cold chill run up his spine. "They're flipping their lids," the first mate screamed. "Oh God, they're running up pirate colors." "Weigh anchor. Wireless officer, send a warning to the fleet and to Naval Command." The communications officer started turning the dial when there was a sharp report, and the officer's face exploded in a red mist of blood and bone. He crumpled to the ground. "Snipers!" the captain screamed, and then the air was filled with nearby thunder. The British fleet opened fire. "Return fire!" the commander yelled. The frigates began a targeted attack on the Roxana's staysails, top, and foresails. Their sheets were shredded in a heartbeat. Then came the sound that Bocek most dreaded, the sound of his masts breaking up under the incoming fire. Captain Bocek heard thunder from aft and knew that the other 2 ships were under fire as well. For some reason, all shots went high, and other than the radio men, no one on deck was being targeted. Roger was drawing closer, closing the distance. Prepare to repel boarders." As the men went to the weapons locker, a rain of gunshots tore them apart. Bocek turned his head. The gunwales bristling with snipers and men with long arms. He sighed, and then ordered the men to drop arms and run up the surrender flag. The Roger started throwing grappling lines, securing the Roxana to her. Immediately, men began swinging over and boarding the ship. A gangway slid across, and there came what had to be the commander. He wore a long red overcoat, a wide black hat, and a cutlass. In his hands he brandished a pistol. The man looked intimidating. Long flowing black curls, a waxed mustache, and pointed goatee. He was flanked by 2 well-dressed officers. He boarded the ship and looked over at his men, all uniformed, and they secured the ship. These were no ordinary groups of brigands. This smelled of a military seizure. He wondered if the Red Nation and Bryton had gone to war. If they had, no one told him, he was going to be rather put out. "Secure all wireless devices. Check ship, top to bottom." "Good day, Captain." The British commander looked about the ship. Smoking sheets, rope lines, and broken masts littering the deck. "Rather dreary, eh, what?" "Sir, may I have the name of the officer that attacked my fleet?" Bocek was desperately trying to keep his rage in check. The British commander looked at him with disdain. "No." With that, he raised his gun and shot the red captain in the face, sending him falling backwards, then looked about. "Anybody else have a question?" The Roxana's crew said nothing. "Lovely! Wonderful!" He turned to the 2 officers with him and whispered, "You and you, see to it that all officers and able-bodied men are brought to the deck and shot. Bring all women to the bridge, make sure the ship is searched, and the women are searched for jewelry." The British commander waited and smoked a cigarette as the ship's complement was brought up to the deck. The commander looked at a pocket watch. 10 minutes. The passengers were all well-dressed, obviously of the upper class. They all looked terrified as the British crewmen separated the men and women. "You there," he pointed to George. "Come here, lad." The young officer walked over, hands in the air. "Please don't shoot me." He looked down at his dead captain. "I won't make any trouble." "Of course not. You see, my bright lad, I have some questions." "Yes, sir," George replied. "Now, who has the keys to the strong box?" "I know it's not the captain. Who is the cargo officer? You know, the officer that doesn't dress like an officer?" He put his hand on George's shoulders and continued. "I know that the red procedure is not to give the captain the keys, but to make everyone think that the loot is locked at the departing port and unlocked at the receiving port. This I know. I also know that the bridge officers are informed on who the secret cargo officers are in case he dies, or the captain dies. So let's avoid unnecessary killing. Who is the cargo officer?" The mail clerk, Dimitri," George spoke, frightened. "I told you, So, please, no more shooting, sir. The commander smiled and patted the man on the back and then turned and yelled at the prisoners. You see? Cooperation. This is what we need. This will be rewarded. The British commander turned to the crowd. Who's Dmitri? One man stepped forward. Da, I am he. Excellent. Give me the strongbox keys, please. The male clerk took a necklace from around his neck. On the chain was a series of small brass keys. He handed it to the invading commander. Please to take treasure and leave us. We will cause no troubles. No more shooting, the clerk stated with some tone of authority. Of course not. You're correct. No more shooting is needed at all. The commander patted the man on the shoulder. The cargo officer sighed, relaxing. The commander turned and walked away, nodding at one of his men. Run him through. Immediately swords were drawn. The crew charged forward and began to run through and slaughter the crowd of men. There was a brief attempt at resistance, but to no avail. The women screamed in horror. Get the booty, the commander smiled as he watched the last red man fall. God, I hate those Cossacks. The commander planted his hand on George's shoulder, still at his side, and looked at him solemnly. You were helpful. Now I'm going to give you a choice. You can stay here on the boat. No sails, no way to go anywhere. Oh, you'll have 1 day's food and 1 day's water. Or I can put you in a lifeboat with 3 days' water and 3 days' food. We'll give you 1 oar. So, what's your choice? The crewman looked panicked. What about the women? George asked. You see? He asked about the women. This is a quality sailor. He turned to the crewman. I'm going to give you 2 oars if you take the lifeboat, and I'm not going to let you stay on your ship. The man was confused. Sir? The commander chuckled. You see, we're going to sink the ship. It was a trick. He pointed to one of his officers. Get this lad out of my sight and in a lifeboat. Don't shoot him or the boat either. He saluted George. I promote you to captain. Enjoy your command, sir. The Brits dragged him off and tossed him in a lowered lifeboat. Once he was gone, the British commander took off his hat and shook his hair out. This was a sign that names could now be used. The men came up from beneath decks and dropped a heavy iron chest on the ground. Hooker gave a twisted smile and, bending over, inserted the key into the heavy padlock. The key gave a satisfying clink and then fell open. Hooker moved the padlock, and there was a low humming, and deep from within the box there was a sound of something delicate shattering and then grinding. Hook positively shrieked in fury. No! 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 Damn it! No! Once the grinding ceased, the lid popped open. As the lid opened, smoke and the odor of acrid chemicals filled the air. The cunning bastard! He gave me a false key, Hooker fumed. He knelt down and looked inside the case, sighing. What a damn waste of time! Using his glove hand, he picked up the shell of what might have been a small personal firearm. His first officer came over. Yes, Mr. Starkey? Orders, Admiral Hooker? Check all ships. Make sure there's no trouble. Loot the ship from stem to stern. Make sure to check under the floors in the galley, captain's quarters, and mailroom. Once completed, the crew may take liberty call with the remaining passengers. He looked over at the women. He pointed at one woman with copper-red hair. That one delivered to my room. Might as well get some satisfaction from this debacle. Seeing Hooker point, the woman was grabbed and pulled to be transferred to the Roger. A small girl of about 12 or 13 screamed after her mother. Put the girl children in a lifeboat? Hooker shook his head and moved to the gangway. No survivors. My benevolence has been expended for the day. He nodded in the direction of the rowing man. As soon as liberty is over, sink all ships and throw the survivors in the water. The cold temperature will do our work for us. Liberty call, men! Hook yelled across the deck to the sound of cheers. The women crowded back against the fantail. Some began jumping overboard. Shoot the swimmers, though. Sir? The young lasses! The first mate looked horrified. Hooker turned and stared at the first mate with a wicked grin. Come, Starkey, why should they be let off the hook? The first mate, seeing what was transpiring, vomited over the railing. Afterwards, he looked up and saw a black albatross on the fantail. It bobbed its head, seemingly laughing. This frightened him all the more. George rowed into the fog bank. He would wait till there was the sound of cannon fire and then return for survivors. He lay down and curled up in a ball, covering his ears from the scream. He would remember the name of the ship. Jolly Roger. Jolly Roger. Jolly Roger. He muttered repeatedly. He would survive. He swore to God he would survive. Not for himself, but for them. In chapter 1. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of slow down. Okay. I will work on that. That is a bad habit of mine. Chapter 2. Kensington Palace, Bryton, April 18th, 1876. A little heads up. Sarah and Stephen in this chapter are named after my children. Sarah and Stephen pushed and shoved the sea. Sarah, nearly 20, looked elegant and refined. Her dress was diaphanous, her done to perfection. She'd spent all evening putting the finishing touches on her gown. She was every inch the regal lady. Stephen, 5 years her junior, was acting as an icebreaker through the human ocean. "It's no use, sis. We're not going to be able to get any closer." He was about the same size, thinner, with an engaging smile. The two looked almost identical in features. Dismissing the obvious gender differences, the chief difference between the two was her straighter, albeit wavy, tresses and his much curlier hair. Stephen's locks resembled something akin to a brown sheep sleeping on his head. Stephen threw his hands up in dismay and resolved to be relegated to craning his neck for a peek. Sarah furrowed her brow and then tapped a man on the shoulder. "Beg pardon." The man turned and sniffed at the girl, obviously not wanting to be bothered. "Perhaps the kind lord would allow us to go to the edge of the balcony to see the ceremony." She indicated her brother. "You see, the young lad has bone sickness, and it was one of his greatest desires to be able to see the festivities before he passes into Abraham's bosom." The genteel lady smiled her kindest smile and fluttered her eyes like a newborn doe. Stephen coughed on cue. "I think not." The man eyed the boy dubiously. He turned his back on Sarah. She sighed and shot a hard elbow in the man's rib. Howling, he hopped back, holding his side. Sarah and Stephen moved in to grab the railing. "Oh, beg pardon. So clumsy of me." Sarah fluttered her eyes. The man grumped and mumbled, moving off. The two youths moved quickly up to the railing. "There's the pan!" Sarah pointed excitedly. His Royal Majesty, David James Matthews Charles I, Protector of the Air Nation, sat on his throne. Resplendent in green, he waved at the crowd. A side door opened up, and with an entourage, a small, slender woman in her 20s came out. She wore a gilded winged crown, a royal forest-colored gown, and a long rose-colored train trimmed in mink and sable. As she moved towards the king, he nodded and stared at a squirming bundle in her arms. The trumpeter walked out and began sounding. King David stood, and the moment everyone stood. Hang on, that's badly written. This is where the editing comes in. King David stood, and at that moment everyone stood proud and still. The king's herald stood forward. "Queen Margaret Ogilvy, Regina Airnadia, wishes to come forth and present her son, Peter John Bryan, heir to the throne, and your new pan." The hall remained silent, waiting with bated breath, as Queen Margaret moved toward the central red carpet and stood before her throne at the king's left. She lifted up the pink squirming mass, and as the blanket fell away, those nearest could see the royal birthmark on his fleshy chest. The hall exploded in applause. Young Prince Peter did not like the noise and began to cry. The Queen smiled and sat down, comforting him. Two laborers moved a bassinet in the style of the parental thumbs, placing it for the first time at the king's right hand. Peter, now placated and asleep, was lowered into it, taking his place. His father smiled and waved his hand to commence the festivities that would go on for some time. 2 hours after the celebration, Wendy stood in the bathroom, running her hand over the swell of her belly. She was grateful the required full dress uniform, as it was very concealing, because short of that there was going to be no hiding it anymore. The Countess of Birmingham, the Right Honorable Admiral Winifred Jane Darling of His Majesty's Royal Navy, was going to be an unwed mother. She had gone and gotten herself with child. It had all started 6 months ago. She requested a transfer to desk duty at the Kensington Palace to work with her brother at the Royal Fleet Engineer School. As a cousin to the Queen, she was permitted to ask and to appoint entitled to live in one of the Kensington Palace's hundreds of apartments. She and her brother John had submitted designs for a new ship of the line for review. It would be the grandest airship ever to have a keel laid. The King was enthusiastic and authorized the Chancellor of the Exchequer to provide the funds for it. It was there she had met the King's bodyguard, Alistair. He was handsome, dashing, and made the King's Admiral a touch weak in the knees. They kept their public conversations respectable and aloof, but in their private moments he had used his skills and stealth to visit her in her private chambers and made the profound mistake of falling in love. Unlike her more sober and devout brothers, she had much less restraint in affairs of the heart. They had fallen into passion's embrace, and, while they exercised as much discipline and tactical controls as they possessed, he had put one shot too many across her bow, and after docking his man-of-war, had offloaded cargo onto her dock. Now here she was, one of the King's finest admirals, a woman in her mere 20s, with child. Wendy sat down naked on the coal floor and wept convulsively. She had sworn Up and down, she would not give in to the emotions that so frequently beleaguer their fairer sex. Lying down nude on the floor, she pounded her fist over and over until the porcelain tiles shattered and cut her hands. There was no way she would cause herself to miscarry, and yet no way to ask Alistair to marry her. The King's Guard were, by law, forbidden to marry, and, as the first female admiral in Bryton's history, she could not afford to be seen as a hussy or a woman of loose moral character. All she could do was talk to her youngest brother and seek his advice. Let's see. Thank you, Lewis. I see the post. Chapter 3. Wendy's Heartbreak. Wendy went to John's office. It was a huge room filled with books, charts, scale models, and blueprints of all shapes and sizes. John and Wendy were building not only the largest naval vessel ever made, but also the largest airship ever made. He had to fashion 2 airships and 1 ship of the line, to be precise. Both airships would be an intrinsic part of converging them into one massive vessel. John was busy talking to carpenters and lumber dealers when Wendy came in, looking haggard and emotionally upset. She looked up, and John knew without her saying a word what to do. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I would like to speak to the Admiral alone." The men nodded and took their leave, offering good days, madams, and hello, admirals, as they left. The last man out closed the door so that the brother and sister were now alone in the cavernous room. "Winnie, whatever is the matter?" He ran over and wrapped his arms around her as she collapsed in a manner most inconsistent with her nature. She cried for several minutes until spent, then started apologizing. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've gone and done something horribly foolish." John hugged her tight and sat her down in a chair. "It's about you and Alistair, isn't it?" John sat down on the edge of his desk, pushing books aside. Wendy jerked her head up, and whatever blood she had left in her face drained away like rain on a plate glass window. "How did you know? Oh, God, everyone must know." She started to panic. "Relax, big sister. No one knows but us 3, he explained. "I was going to check on you one evening because you'd missed an appointment with the cannoneers. I started to go down towards your room when I saw 2 lovebirds kissing in an alcove. The moon broke through the clouds for just a moment, and I saw that it was you and Alistair. I didn't say anything because it's none of mine, if you'll pardon the term, affair. Neither of you are married, and you're both adults, so I can gather from your general state and your current choice of wardrobe that you must now be in a family way." He crossed his arms. "Am I wrong?" She shook her head back and forth as if to say no. "I don't know what to do. There's no way I want to lose this child. It's ours and I love it, but I don't want to disgrace him or myself for that matter." John nodded. He started walking around the room for a moment, and laying his hand on a large globe, stood there for a moment, then faced her. "I'll spare you a lecture on morals or chastity for 2 reasons. 1, it's far too late for that, and 2, well, I don't think you need that right now." "Thanks, Johnny." She sighed and sipped some water from a nearby crystal glass. "The ship of the line is due for major work this summer. There's really nothing you can do, as you've already approved the plans. It will take at least 6 months for construction to bring her to being seaworthy, and another 3 to being airworthy." She saw where he was going. "How far along are you?" "I think 2, maybe 3. It's been that long since—" He waved his hands at her in a plea for no details, and his cheeks flushed. Okay. She stopped and giggled a little. He mouthed a small thanks. "There's a family retreat in Kentshire. Go there. I'll send someone to help you. I'll hire a nurse for you. You don't need to spend any money of your own, lest it be traced back to you. God knows there's enough detractors that would love to bring you down." "But what about after it's born?" Wendy was beginning to cry again. "I won't tell you what to do. What I will say is this. If you keep the baby, your career is over. Done. You're finished militarily. Everything you'll ever work for will be completely wasted. Now you're a grown woman, and you've made your bed and slept in it. This is the reality." Wendy stuck her chin out. Though she wanted to defend herself, she knew John was right. As progressive as King David was, he would not be able to defend a military admiralty to a tainted woman. "Now your last alternative, barring infanticide, is adoption. You can find a nice family, a respectable one, and make certain the child is cared for." He went over to his desk and opened a leather-bound volume. He quickly scrawled out a letter. He folded it and sealed it. Ringing a bell, a young page came in. He handed the boy the letter and gave him the whispered instruction. The boys left in a hurry. He walked back over to Wendy. "I've told the boy to take that to the Exchequer. When you go there, there will be £5,000 available to you immediately, with another 10,000 available to you at your discretion." He hugged his sister. "I would beg your leave of the king. Tell him you are unwell and need of a leave of absence. You worked on this project for months without a break. It's not uncommon for officers to need a leave. You're also a noble, and you can do so simply by virtue of your title. I will reassure the king that all will continue as planned on this ship. In 10 months I will expect you to return, and this matter will be behind you." Wendy just nodded like a chastened squirrel. When he finished, she looked up, hazel eyes sparkling with tears. What do I tell Alistair? I will deal with that as well. She started to say something, but John shook his head. He must never, never know. It will only result in his disgrace as well. If he does figure it out, well, then that's a matter for you two to contend with. With that, he kissed his sister on the forehead and took his leave. Wendy sat there alone in her large room with her thoughts. Okay. Chapter 4. February 1st, 1877. The castle was abuzz with the return of Admiral Darling. There had been much rumor and gossip about the circumstances of her departure. The general consensus was that she had fallen in disfavor with the king. But as she returned, the king and queen seemed generally pleased to see her. Upon the one-year anniversary of her departure, they stood next to each other at the commissioning of the HMS Whitebird. It was a huge celebration as he awarded her the commission. Admiral Hooker even congratulated her and seemed pleased to have her back. Some did notice one of the king's personal bodyguards, who had been somewhat sullen, now seemed a mite happier. However, as the crew of the Whitebird was selected, absolutely no one thought anything of the new ship's cook being assigned there, and her husband, who acted as the butcher. That in itself was not unusual. That they had a newborn son who was only 2 months old was. Chapter 5. Okay, you guys have been very patient. We now have something that you will enjoy very, very much. Again, just giving authors editing notes. It was very, very challenging to attempt to lay all the groundwork and build everything up. And now the shenanigans begin. Chapter 5, April 18th, 1878. Admiral James Hooker stood anxiously outside the king's office in the waiting room. The royal waiting room was larger than the main deck of many of Admiral Hooker's ships. There was a musician in the corner playing some light piece on a harpsichord, a tiny dandy in a golden clothes with a powdered wig. His nimble fingers danced on the keys and filled the air with a sweet little melody. Original piece, he was sure, because Hooker did not know the piece and was quite well versed in the classics. The Admiral was bedecked in his smartest dressed uniform, a deep red with white and gold trim, and his hair was coiffed and ribboned. It was no wig, and Hooker resented that anyone would ever assume that his own lovely locks was some tawdry hairpiece. He looked down at his nails, newly manicured and polished. He reset his sword at his side, redistributing the weight of the baldric, and pushed away non-existent lint. Hooker despised waiting on anyone, but tolerated it, of course, for his king. A great many servants came up periodically, asking him if he needed anything, drinks, food, or simply anything at all. The dessert cart was nearby and tantalizing, but the Admiral would not risk a wayward crumb on his suit, or even a far worse tragedy, something being lodged in his teeth. He stood there for a while and started to pace nervously. The servants had the good graces to stay out of the way. Hearing a commotion, he turned, but the sound came from the wrong direction. The outer door opened, and in came a young, handsome butler, escorting an exquisitely lovely young lady, all resplendent in white finery and lace. She had on a black shawl and a golden cross. As she saw Hooker, she curtsied. "Elspeth, my love!" Hooker moved to her, made to hug her, but caught himself and settled on taking her hand, and, bowing, kissed her knuckles. The butler retreated, and the other servants faded invisible, for all intents and purposes, against the walls. "James, I'm honored that you would bring me here. It will be a delight to share this day with you." Elspeth was lovely, tall for a woman, approaching 5'8". Her black hair, resting against her white finery and her porcelain skin, made her appear even more genteel to James. He held her hand as she sat down on a plush silken settee. It is of course a secret, even I'm not supposed to know, but the scuttlebutt is in the wind that His Majesty shall be granting me the Grand Admiralty today. Ever since I defeated the Red Men's fleet at the Battle of Lorsamo, it has been the talk. Elspeth fanned herself and looked quizzical. She had known James for quite a while. The two had a quiet and discreet romance, and thus she knew that James was given to frequent bouts of hyperbole. "You're an admiral now. What's the difference between that and Grand Admiralty?" Hooker laughed and twisted the end of his mustache. Patting Elspeth's hands, he kissed her cheek, a severe breach of protocol. Her cheeks flushed a bit in both anger and embarrassment. "I'm admiral of his nautical fleet, much as the same as Admiral Darling is admiral of His Majesty's aerial fleet." He got up and walked about, running his fingers over table, checking for dust. He found none. "The Grand Admiral will have command of all his navies." James Hooker paced back and forth. He laughed softly. I dare say the competition for this post is negligible. Tower will never amount to much, and the chance he would choose a young woman like Darling? Laughable. Why don't you like Winifred? I've always found her to be such, well, a darling, she tittered. Hooker turned back and waved a white glove back and forth, tisking softly. Oh, don't be fooled. The Darling family is not to be trusted. But she's the Queen's cousin. More of a sister, really. The Queen trusts her implicitly. Precisely why she is not to be trusted. She is the Queen's ear, who of course the King dotes on. I have told the King for years that it is imperative to let me take command of the air fleet. Admiral Darling is far too passive and gentle with our enemies. We need to crush our enemies under our heels, eliminate them as threats. Only once we have complete naval and air dominance will Bryton rule supreme. He was quite animated. Elspeth straightened her wrap and motioned to one of the servants. The aide came and set a small gilt box on the table before her. Elspeth inspected it as she spoke. You know that as heir of the Aeronaudio, he has always been a peaceable man. It is not in his nature to rule by force. He always has been a man of peace and diplomacy. Elspeth waved another servant over and bought her a glass of wine. The servant looked at Hooker, inquiring silently if he wanted a drink. He waved the servant away. Precisely my point, love. Precisely my point. Hooker sat down on the arm of the sofa. Look at where we are now. The Star Republic is at war with the Redmen. The Tiger King is, at this moment, trying to get us to sign a treaty to remain neutral in the war. My fleet cannot have free passage through the seas anymore, and His Majesty tells me that I cannot fire unless fired upon? Hooker sounded disgusted. Their ships are far more dangerous than ours because the Machinists Guild will not share their technology with us, except in small, limited amounts. He was positively livid. Us, the mightiest nation on earth, and they dictate what we can and cannot have. That is not even the best of it. We have ceded our sovereignty to keep peace with the Terrans and the people of the ice. Not 70 years ago, his father said that within 100 years we would rule air, land, and sea. He shook his face in impotent rage at the wall. A soft voice cut through the room. The king stood in the doorway. My father was young, not even 11 years old, when he said that, James, as you well know. Was it not your father and his father that were my father and his fathers, Grand Admirals? Moreover, was it not your grandfather that encouraged him to dream as the air people are wont to do? I do believe that those were simpler days, James. Not so any more. The king was in a reserved outfit of black, his waistcoat covering a white baldric on which was one piece of adornment, the crest of the royal house, a winged thistle. He had his hands behind his back and looked quite sad. As he moved into the room, the shadows in the corners appeared to darken for a second. Hooker accounted it absent-mindedly as a trick of the light. The king ran a hand over his long face. Elspeth could see that he looked very tired. His hair, a touch grayer than the last time she saw him, such was the weight of the throne. The king's legendary red hair had now faded to a dull, brassy color. Your Majesty, I do apologize. I was out of line, Hooker bowed. The king smiled sadly before extending his hand to Elspeth. Your Royal Highness, Elspeth said, as she went to stand. He motioned her to stay seated. James, how can I be angry when you bring your lovely friend to grace us? He bowed and kissed her offered hand. Sister Elspeth, how is her eminence? Elspeth smiled. The needs of the faithful are many, and she sends her best wishes and a gift for your son's... She hesitated, thinking. 4th, the king reminded. Yes, of course, do forgive me. His 4th birthday. She brought out the small box wrapped in silken paper. Most kind, most kind. The king bowed slightly and handed the gift off to a young woman who appeared to be a governess. She took the box and stepped aside. To be delicate, Madam Ambassador, I was not expecting you to be here at this time. Admiral Hooker bowed slightly. If you'd forgive the impertinence, Your Majesty. Hooker took a step towards the two. Sister Elspeth is an old friend, and I invited her to be here for your announcement. The king looked a bit frustrated and stared heavily, almost sadly, at his admiral. He turned and nodded to Elspeth. I'd hoped to discuss some military matters with James today. As you know, we have a treaty to sign tomorrow, and there's a great deal to do. Of course, she looked quizzically at Admiral Hooker. It is, of course, for the treaty signing I'm here as Her Eminence as signatory. My king, I asked Elspeth to join me early, for I do believe it shall be a momentous occasion. Hooker pushed. A look of enlightenment and realization crossed the king's face. Oh, James, my friend, I do believe you're under a mistaken assumption. There was a motion at the door, and a young woman in her late 20s stood there in full military dress, a saber at her side. Her uniform was similar in cut to Admiral Hooker's, but was an eggshell blue color. Sister Elspeth, I do believe you know Admiral Darling? Winifred, Elspeth smiled, and then seeing the king looked over at James and then back at the Air Admiral. Elspeth put two and two together, and her heart sank for her consort. Well, best to press on and deal with matters as they lay, the king sighed. Admiral Hooker, I have just commissioned Admiral Winifred Darling to be the Grand Admiral of my combined fleets. Moreover, it has become necessary to levy charges against you of a criminal nature based upon the reports that have come to me of your behavior and conduct at the massacre of Lorzimore. Hooker looks stunned and all the blood drained from his face. Massacre? That was a battle, Hooker spoke up in outrage. Who dares calls it a massacre? The king ignored Hooker's insubordination and turned to Grand Admiral Darling. The younger officer nodded and produced a parchment from her dress overcoat. She broke the wax seal and, unfolding it, spoke in a clear and unemotional voice, much as if she was reciting a recipe. Admiral Hooker, of the first matter and specification, we have 29 witnesses, officers of the Crown, and a crewman of your ship that have, under sworn oath, stated that on the date of July 6, 1875, you did order your fleet to come alongside, under flags of friendship, a convoy belonging to the Crown of the Red Peoples. That you did, without provocation, order your fleet to willingly, and without mercy, open cannon fire with the intent of crippling and later to sink all ships of said convoy. Then, only then, upon your opening salvos, did they return fire. Of the second matter and specification, that you did board the vessels, put their men to the sword's edge, shot, and murdered their women and children. We cannot confirm, but have allegations of you allowing your men to ravish and abuse most discourteously some of the surviving women and girls, who afterwards were cast to the sea where they were expected to, and did most succinctly die. Oh, James, no, Elspeth held her hand to her face. Grand Admiral Darling continued. Of the third and final specification of the charge is that upon the swift execution of all crew and passengers, you did, in violation of all codes of royal conduct, steal and loot from their ships, that you did dispense, under orders of secrecy, treasures and properties that belonged to the Crown of the Red People, to your coffers, then paid it out to the coffers of your officers and crew as booty. That you did, sir, by the commission of these acts, degenerate your command into that of a common pirate. She folded the charges up and offered them to Hooker. He refused to take them, so Darling allowed them to drop at his feet. The king stood there, purple with rage, but maintaining his decorum. I stand here, Admiral Darling crossed her hands behind her back and pressed on, before my majesty, and on occasion would happen, before an ambassador in sigil of the faithful, I command you before crown and God to declare your innocence or admit your guilt, Grand Admiral Darling demanded. Hooker looked positively sick and leaned forward towards his king. Admiral Darling made certain to keep position between the two men. David, we've been friends for years. I was the best man at your wedding. Surely you cannot give credence to these baseless accusations, Hooker pleaded. Baseless? The king turned. Baseless, you say? He nodded and looked wearily at his friend. James, these accusations came to me months ago. Months. I refused to believe them at first. I thought, this is my friend and godfather to my son. But in fairness and effort to defend my best friend's honor, I commissioned a private and secret investigation, fully expecting to exonerate you. He stood over by the majestic windows, his body a mere shadow against the light. I just want you to know, James, I simply did not believe it. I've known you to be a good friend, a patriot, and a fine officer. But I was so blind. He turned and looked back at James, now filled with wrath and righteous fury, the feeling of defeat gone like a sandcastle washed away by the waves. Your crew is loyal. I'll give you that, James. They desired to keep their tongues still. However, their allegiance to the crown was greater. I had to offer amnesty to some and threats to others, but in time they spoke. All of your officers spoke. We audited their books and monies. We presented them with the facts, and they all gave the same story, James. Your barbarous lies and acts that you committed under my flag did not, nor could not, stay hidden. He turned and slapped the sailor hard across the face, sending him sprawling to the floor. Under my flag? He roared in rage, spit flying from his lips. You raped women and young girls in my name? How dare you? You put children to the sword, you monstrous bastard. Not children, Hooker muttered as he stood up. I killed no children. What did you say to me? The king demanded. The only things I put to death were the mongrel red men who were unworthy of even being called humans. Hooker staggered to his feet. Look at them. They live in a manner not even befitting being called a real culture. They know nothing of property, sharing everything with everyone. They reject God, and their people wear clothes made of animals and fur. They roam their cursed lands, living next to volcanoes for heat. Have you ever been out to the fire steps, David? Hooker looked disgusted. A grand social experiment indeed, he snorted. Savages. Savages all. Oh, they have their cities, yes, but they didn't even build them themselves. They had to get the Machinist Guild to do it for them. And then, he put his hand to his lip and wiped away the blood, then they have the audacity to tell the Guild to share nothing with us? He chuckled sadly. Laughable. So completely laughable. The king looked at his old friend questioningly. What is? James looked at David with astonishment. You are! Hooker spat. You're willing to sell out our people to the barbaric hordes of the bloody red man for what? Peace treaties? Maybe gold? Maybe a few mechanical gadget? The greatest traitor I've ever seen. He lunged towards the king in a rush of anger, dropping to his duty saber. Before he was able to take 2 steps, the dark corners of the room exploded with life. From those black recesses, 4 men moved forward. Featureless, silent, and fast, the king's shadow guard grabbed Hooker's arms, one placing his arm around Hooker's throat, and the last grabbing a sword out of his sheath. Grand Admiral Darling drew her sword, and stepping between Hooker and her king, she placed her sword tip at Hooker's Adam's apple. She looked at Hooker with blood in her eye, glancing at her king, awaiting permission to strike the pirate down. No, Admiral Darling, I will not kill my friend. He glanced at Elspeth. By the right of God, as king of the air people and sovereign of the nation of Bryton, I, David, Protector Aeronaudio, supreme commander of all forces, do hereby strip you of your admiralty, strike you of any rights and privileges of rank, and forbid you to wave the colors of your nation. I order that your lands, properties, and possessions be sold, and that all those proceeds and monies be sent to the families of your victims as restitution. The king held his hand out to one of the guards, and Hooker's sword was handed, pommel first, to the king. King David looked at Hooker's saber, a sword that he himself had given his friend upon Hooker's first command. Swiftly, the king jerked his bent leg up, bringing the saber down quickly, and snapped the sword over his knee. You are to be returned to your ship, the Jolly Roger. Your fellow pirates are there waiting. I banish you and your crew, and declare you exiles of this nation. Should you ever enter the water or air of our nation, you will be fired upon and sunk. If you are captured alive, I shall order you to be placed in a crow's cage to die as a common pirate, and upon your death your body shall be fed to the pigs. Hooker looked on his king in disbelief. The king leaned into James' face. Have I in any way made myself unclear? James Hooker, pirate, stood before his king. No, my liege. He hung his head. The king turned his back on Hooker, no longer able to stomach looking at him. Get this man off my shores. Give his crew food and water for 3 days, and if he turns his sails about, sink him. The king strode out. Admiral Darling stepped forward and slapped Hooker hard across the face, blooding his nose. Strip him of his uniform, and then burn it. The shadow guards started to pull Hooker's uniform off him, and the pirate stared at Grand Admiral Darling with a hard, long hate. Elspeth just cried. Let's see. I'm going to skip a little bit here because you guys have all been very patient. And Peter and Tinkerbell don't show up for a little bit longer. So, having started off and branded Hooker a pirate, I'm going to treat you guys to the first appearance of Peter and Tink, because surely that's why most of you really, really want to hear. And so let me skip up here. Let's see. Let's see. We have that much farther here before Peter and Tink show up. So, Book 2, Part 1, 18 years later. That's basically what. Well, I'll give you a little synopsis. Hook returns, kills the royal family. Wendy has to hide Peter in another dimension, which we also skipped over. Tesla shows up, and you find out quite a few things about Tesla. But I'm not going to read those because I don't want to spoil it. But Chapter 21. The blue light of the Tesla coils reflected in the brass of her goggles as she polished them. She pushed up the leather hood, and her black hair blew in the cold air that came through the porthole. Winifred Darling was a stickler for looking her best, and today was no different. She reached over and lit the lamp, the cold bulb slowly brightening as the electricity flowed freely. She settled the goggles back on her hood, leaning over to tighten the laces on her boots. Her leather corset squeaked and creaked, and matching nicely with the sounds of the wooden vessel, she rested her foot on a stool, then slowly and meticulously laced first the right and then the left. Wendy was a very organized, and some would say, anal retentive person. "Captain Windy! Captain Windy!" she heard from the door, followed by soft rapping. It was Toodles, one of the crewmen, who, though nearly 6 feet tall and 300 pounds, was ever so much the little boy. He could never produce Wendy's name right and always called her Wendy, and because of that half the people she knew thought that's how she spelled her name. Wendy dropped her boots down on the deck and, tilting her head, smiled at the deckhand. Her smile earned her a slight blush of unrequited love, and Toodles quickly forgot why he was there. "Yes, dear. What is it, hun?" Wendy said sweetly as she stood up and adjusted her clothing and checked the cinches on her pistol holster. Toodles watched her closely. Wendy was not ever so tall, but she was fit, just shy of too buxom, and her top was her best feature. She caught Toodles' gaze and adjusted her blouse to cover a bit more than he needed to see. She was not a body woman and did grow weary of being stared at. It didn't help to ensure crew obedience if everyone was wondering what the captain was like in the hammock. You had something you wanted to tell me?" Wendy was always patient with Toodles. She'd rescued him from a beating he was getting by a bunch of buccaneers in port. She quickly gave them a come-to-Jesus meeting at the end of her 2 cutlasses. Toodle, though large enough to fight, hadn't wanted to and just sat there weeping through the beating. "Yeah," Toodles said as he regained his wits. "Curly said that he has a message for you, and it's really important. He's at the wheel." Toodles smiled and received his reward. Wendy gave him a kiss on the forehead, and she walked out of her wardroom. Toodles blushed a deeper red and quickly scampered away. Wendy strode across the polished wooden decks, listening to the familiar sounds that were music to her ears. The sound of singing ropes, jangling chains, and rustling canvas sails. Then there was the sound of humming brass as the steam moved through the pipes and the deep bass drumming of the engines. It was her personal sympathy. Her boot heels clicking on the heel was like the sound of a conductor tapping his baton. She walked across the main deck and, turning up the gangway stairs, arrived at the helmsman's wheel at the aft castle. Curly was a tall man, nearly 7 feet tall, a tree with legs. Wendy smiled whenever she saw him. His craggy face was topped with a crop of golden curls. His craggy face was topped with a crop of golden curls. Much more belonged on the head of a small moppet in a frilly dress. He was steering the wheel as he talked to 2 black-haired twins who were leaning over navigational charts. "I had told you that you was to head far to the south," one yelled at the other. No, you told me to go south. You said we should go south-southwest." Basta. You're right. I said go south-southwest, not south. South is not southwest. South-southwest is where we're supposed to go," the other twin said as he slapped his brother in the head. "How are my lost boys today?" Wendy said to her helmsman and navigators. The 2 smiled. "Capitano Darling, we're doing very, very good. The winds are favorable and we're making good time." "Mostly," Uno Pozzuoli said cheerfully. "He said go south," Due said slowly. Wendy held up his hands and the bickering stopped. "Curly?" Curly looked at Duo, and the younger twin took over the wheel. Curly reached into his leather vest and pulled out an envelope sealed with a wax symbol. She turned it over in her hand and saw the symbol. "Is this who I think it is?" Wendy said incredulously. She looked at Curly slowly and cautiously. "The same. It was given to me by Thomas not 5 hours ago. I had been down in Bristolville getting some medicine on the port call. He came up behind me. I knew it was him by the sound. You know how that is. He asked if the ship was going to make port there, and then he laughed at the question. He told me that he had a message and that it was for you alone. Then he placed it in my very hand with the explicit orders to give it to you exactly at 7 o'clock on this date, which it now is. You know how he is about keeping time. He's punctual, I'll give you that," Wendy nodded and broke the seal. She read slowly, and Curly saw the color drain from her face. She staggered back, and Uno and Due moved towards her, and she waved them off. She looked at them and then grabbed the map. "Ma'am?" Curly asked slowly. "What is it?" "Peter's lost his shadow." Chapter 22. Shadows of London. The cell was not a big one, nor could it be expected to be. It was for lunatics and the more recalcitrant prisoners, ones that had to be separated from the rest. The 2 constables stood outside the cell, securing the lock and then fastening a second lock on a chain they laced through the bars. "See here, mate, that was a wee bit of not necessary, getting all nasty like that." Prisoner sat on a stool in manacles and tilted his head back and forth, creaking and popping his neck. He was hard to see even up close. His black uniform and neat a darker leather jerkin melting him into the dark, like ink poured on black velvet. "Quite one he is," the second constable said as he hung the keyring on his belt. "Sure enough. What was all that kicking and spinning now, lad? You look like a top on ice. Are you a ballerina or something?" The prisoner just shrugged. One might have assumed a laugh would be forthcoming, but he made no sound at all. "No, probably not. You shouldn't have broken Officer Charles' leg like that. That was very unnecessary." Still no reaction. "Now, Constable Charles is going to have to get his knee all set at the doctor's. He's getting married this weekend. How can a man not dance with his bride on her wedding day? Shame. Just a bleeding shame." "He's to be a groom?" The question was tinged with sorrow. The constables were caught by surprise. "Aye," the older guard said as he stepped up to the bars. "Getting married to a fine young lass. He's a good and proper gentleman, he is. Just 1 year on the beat. Honest, loyal, true, the very model of the Queen's bobby. Neither a drinker nor a lout is our brave Master Tim." The prisoner sighed and leaned his head back, rapping it twice on the wall. "I'm very sorry. Please tell the good officer's fiancée I do apologize." "Oh, I'm sure that'll please her to hear. It'll make her wedding night just that much more joyous as she tries to bet her crippled husband." The constable leaned in so his face touched the bars. "You're a right fine git you are. Hope you do all that nice dancing and spinning on the end of a rope, you bloody bastard." The prisoner said nothing more, but the old constable was quite sure he saw a tear at the corner of the man's eye. The skies above London had been clear, but those gentles and lovers who were prone to watching the night skies saw a rather sudden electrical storm form. It developed quickly and seemed to move almost against the wind. Even odder, one lorry driver noticed that no thunder accompanied the lightning. Officer James Percival John McTavish III sat at the Grand Public Desk in Scotland Yard and cursed the man who invented paperwork. He really wished that he could meet the gin pot that thought that one piece of paper was not enough. No, he had to send each man-jack in charge the same piece of paper. So he wrote and wrote, thanked the stars, that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so that they could get one of those newfangled typeset machines. They were going to send some lad over who had been trained on it. That's the spirit, he thought. Let the young lads do the work. Then he could get back to real police work. He dipped his pen in the inkwell and heard a woman's voice. Looking down from the bench, his first thought was to wonder what it would be like to dip his pen in that well. She was lovely, black hair under a lacy bonnet, wearing a nice, deep blue dress that bustled out around her. She had on a black nightcape, and oddly enough was unaccompanied. Not wise in this part of town in the evening. Still in all, she was at the yard. "Can I help you, love? I've come to pick up a man named Alistair." Her voice was a wee bit rough, and she cleared her throat. "Poor dear needs a cup of water." He offered her one. She smiled and accepted. Sipping slowly, she seemed to take in the room. "Thank you." Sir McTavish searched his forms and prisoner roster. "We have no one by that name, lass." He looked at the papers closer. "What might he have been nicked for?" "Well, I do believe he was probably arrested for fighting and the like. He's a tall man, stout in heart, with a penchant for dark clothes. He might have had a black face mask." The bobby nodded, rang a bell, and a junior officer came from the back. He gave the man the prisoner's description, and the officer nodded, checked his own list, and offered a name. "Ma'am, would a Mr. Shadow mean anything to you?" The lady looked up suddenly. "He's given no name, just said, and I quote, 'I am a shadow.' Kind of daffin' if you'd be asking me." "That's him, I'm sure. May I bond the man out?" The two officers conferred. "I'm sorry. He's to be taken before the magistrate in the morning. He crippled a constable last night. I'm to be thinking he's either a date with a rope or the Island of Wight at best." The lady seemed quite upset by the answer. He leaned over and patted her gloved hand. There, lass. A beauty such as yourself should find a nice, respectable—" He never finished the sentence as the lady grabbed him by the throat, tightly. "No, this won't do. I want Mr. Shadow, and I want him right now." The second officer reached for his nightstick, moving towards the lady quickly. Wendy did not like that she was, on occasion, a bit quick on the draw. She had been told time and again that her emotions clouded her judgment. She sighed and pulled the officer over the bench with her hand gripping his throat. She dropped in the junior copper's way, took advantage of the moment he had to step over the gasping constable and cast off her robe. Her hands pulled out two cutlasses she secreted there, then, turning, ran up the wall and flipped over them. The copper watched as her leather-clad and booted legs belied the false train that hid them. Spinning in the air, she cleft his oak billy club in two and landed on the unconscious man's desk. The younger Bobby went for his whistle, and Wendy kicked him in the face, rendering him unconscious. She tried to remember the map she had read that Uno kept in his map locker, and then dropping down, took the brass key off the young man lying on the floor. She kissed his cheek and apologized, then it disappeared down the hallway. The prison dock was actually fairly quiet. It was midweek, and most trouble took place on the week's end, as most working men were too tired to get into much trouble except on the Sabbath. Wendy ran down the hall, passing the hoots and howls of doxies, trollops, and drunks. She came to the end of the hall when she saw one bluebelly flirting with a soiled dove, trying to get a bit of what for. He saw her, did double take when she saw she was wielding cross blades. "See here now, miss!" Wendy threw one cutlass and pinned him to the wall through the shoulder. The impact wouldn't kill him, but it was unlikely he'd play the same game of cricket again. Wendy slammed up against the amorous lout and held the other blade against his rather thick throat, the blade leaving a sharp impression against his fleshy wattle. Now I shall ask you this once, and only once. Where shall I find a prisoner known as Mr. Shadow?" "Upstairs. One turn right. He's in the lunatic bin. He ain't been hurt, I'll tell you that. He's a bad 'un, though. No lie." The man was panic-stricken. Now be a good lass and pull the blade out. It hurts fierce." Wendy pulled the sword from the man and the oaken door jamb that it had embedded in. The man held a hand to staunch the blood flow. Wendy knocked him down and out on the head with the pommel, and then pulling a cloth kerchief, quickly bound the wound. It would take a few valuable moments, but she didn't want the man to die. She ignored the horror's entreaties to be freed. At the top of the stairs, she came to a locked gate. It was double locked, and she went through another few moments to find the right combination of keys. The gate creaked open, and the chains rattled to the floor. She walked in to see her quarry leaning against the wall, bound in a straitjacket. She went down and grabbed his grizzled face. Then she called his name. She saw no response. "Alistair!" She shook him again and slapped his face. His eyes flickered open, and she saw that they were hazy with stupor. She looked around. On the shelf outside the door she saw a bottle. She moved to it and read the label. Laudanum. Damn it! She moved to the window and, reaching under her bodice, retrieved something. Sticking her hand out the window, she flashed a small beacon. Up in the sky she saw an answering and corresponding flash. Moving to Alistair, she cut the jacket off and shook him harder. She cocked an ear and heard a klaxon begin to wail. "Alistair! Alistair, we don't have time! Wake up!" The man shook his face as if trying to arouse himself from a long slumber, hearing her familiar voice. "Winifred?" he asked slowly, thickly, as if his tongue was asleep as well. "Yes, my dear, it's time to go." There was the sound of a tiny metallic fluttering outside the window, accompanied by the rustle of a rope. Then a slight thud against the wall. "Ow! Damn it!" a thin, annoyed girl's voice muttered. Wendy moved to the window. Two slight gloved hands grabbed the bars, and a tiny, pretty face poked in. "Sorry." "Never mind that. Did you bring it?" Tink nodded and rested a small bag on the window. She popped out a match and lit the strings. "Better move back. It's going to be pretty." Wendy ran over and threw herself over the prisoner. There was a huge explosion, and the side of the wall vanished, rocked and granite shards flying about. Then the smoke cleared. Alistair looked up. What was that? There was a giggle, and Alistair looked outside the hole. A young blonde girl hovered in the air with mechanical clockwork wings beating rapidly, suspending her there. "Fairy dust!" Wendy grabbed Alistair and carried him to the breach. The young girl handed Wendy the rope and secured him about the waist, and holding the rope, she nodded. "Okay, Tink, get us the hell out of here." They quickly ascended up into the lightning storm. Tink looked down at the city below, the moon's reflection on the water. "Ooh, shiny," she giggled. Chapter 23. Peter. Yes, 134 pages into the book, we have Peter. Wednesday night, Peter sat in a tavern. It was crowded, noisy, and filthy. There was a band at the stage singing songs, and he couldn't really follow the theme, but they were good. The floor was a mixture of hay, stubble, drunken bodies, and vomit, the latter usually coming from the former. He himself was in a stool at the bar. He was drunk, to be sure, but he wasn't hungry, and he hadn't been hungry for a few days or so. He thought that the last thing that he'd eaten was about a week ago. That was when he made a very important decision. He had decided, most resolutely, that he was quite sure he was mad. It all started with the ticking. Everywhere he went, he heard ticking. He woke up, ticking. He went down the street, ticking. It was quite annoying. Then there was the matter of his shadow. It had run away from him. No, seriously, his shadow had run away from him. He was standing in an alley off Chicksand and Great Garden, relieving himself, when he heard the ticking again. He turned to look around, and all he saw was a shadow against a wall. Then it ran away. That's odd, he thought. Shadows don't normally do that. They ought not to run away. He followed his shadow. Peter drank from his glass and laughed. He didn't follow it. He chased it. He chased his shadow towards the fire at the end of the alley. When he got there, he turned around because the ticking was there. He saw what was ticking, and then he knew that he was mad. His shadow was talking to a crocodile. No, really, a crocodile. The crocodile was warming himself over his fire. The crocodile was warming himself over a fire. His shadow was talking to the crocodile, and then the pirates fell from the sky. The crocodile pulled a pistol and started to shoot lightning at the pirates. That was when he ran away and started drinking. Crazy stuff, ticking crocodiles, shadows, pirates. So he did what madmen do. He went insane, and he drank a lot. The bartender came over and Peter tapped his glass. "Another." The barkeep shrugged and poured more rum. "Problems, mate?" "There is no problem that cannot be solved by both a liberal application of denial and—" He took a slug of his drink and gasped. "Bad rum." "Woman?" the barkeep asked. "Oh, that it were so simple." "Work? Bad job?" "Not at all, though I have currently changed professions." "To what? From what?" Peter smiled and pointed his finger. For a young man not far in his 20s, he sounded remarkably like a seasoned salaryman. "Well, I was an artist. A good one, too. Tight living, but I rather enjoyed it. So what do you do now, mate?" "I am a lunatic." The barkeep played along. "Much call for that? Room for advancement and all?" "Well, with experience, I hope to perhaps be escalated to the ranks of raving lunatic, but I've just started." "I see. What's the future hold for madmen these days?" "Well, there's Parliament. They seem to have their hands full. But I have reasonable goals. I thought just a nice quiet slide into delirium first, then perhaps full madness." The barkeep nodded and wiped the table. "It's good to have goals." "Indeed." Peter grabbed some roasted peanuts and started chewing when a rather cute girl approached him. Sitting next to him, she seemed to look him over a gander. Peter chewed his peanuts and leaned into her, barked like a dog at her. She smiled and she giggled at him. She was pretty and blonde, and he was young and handsome. He smiled at her. "Bark, bark," Peter said. "Meow, meow," the girl giggled again. "What's your name?" she asked. "Peter Prince," Peter said and ordered her a drink. She had a small gin. "What's yours?" "Angela." She smiled and looked over at Peter. Moving up, she sat in his lap. "You're cute." She ran her hand over his chest. There was a small yet distinct purplish birthmark on his chest resembling a bird in flight. Around his neck, the light caught something that glinted. She touched an antique necklace that sparkled in the light. Her eyes twinkled as she lifted up a small ball that jingled when it moved. "Ooh, pretty, pretty. Where'd you get that?" She looked in his eyes. Peter emptied his glass and belched. He looked at her and apologized. She didn't seem to mind. "I don't really recall. I've always had it, since I was a kid." Peter shrugged and leaned in to kiss her. The girl giggled and she shied away. "Not here, silly. I'm a proper girl." "Maybe you have a flat?" "I do, not far from here, in Whitechapel." He smiled and she took his hand, pulling him up. Peter was drunk and happy, and he was young, and as he was young, was given to quite being randy. Had he known that he would attract such a pretty class of girl, he would have gone insane sooner. They walked down Wentworth till it turned into Old Montague, teetering and tottering. She leaned on him and chattered away. He learned that she was just now 18, as her birthday was this week. He told her that he was about 20, being an orphan, and he wasn't exactly sure when his birthday was, so he celebrated it on Christmas Day because it seemed like a good enough day. She smiled, and every time he tried to kiss her, she would weave away and laugh. So he followed her down the street into his flat at the corner of King Edward. That was when he heard the ticking again and saw the weirdest thing. It was quite late and dark, and the pretty girl waved a shiny light in the air. Then the flying people came again. This was beginning to annoy him quite a bit. "People don't fly," he reasoned. "They just don't." He was quite certain it was a rule somewhere. Right after the rule about shadows running away, and right before the rule about crocodiles shooting lightning at pirates. He looked around for Angela, and she waved at the flying people. Then the crocodile came out of the park. "Yes," he thought as he sat down on the street. "I'm insane." So he did what any insane person would do in this given situation. He fainted. It was windy and cloudy when he woke up. The first thing he noticed was that there was no ticking. That's good. No ticking is always good. He kept his eyes closed, and then he heard giggling, along with what sounded like the whirring of gears and cogs and flapping. "Peter, open your eyes! It's pretty!" Well, that sounds promising. So he opened his eyes and saw Angela's pretty face. There above her was a flying ship. A flying pirate ship, to be specific. That's unusual, Peter thought. "Pretty, pretty," Angela said. Something stuck out in his mind. "Angela, do you have wings?" "Uh-huh." She wiggled her bright, shiny brass wings as they flew up towards the flying pirate ship. "Thought so. Just checking. Aren't they pretty? I made them myself." "Of course you did. How silly of me for not knowing that." She giggled. The Pretty flying girl waved her shiny, coppery mechanical wings at him as they flew above London to the flying ship in the middle of the really quiet lightning storm. Angela, might I ask a question? Okay. Where are we going? Neverland, Peter. We're going to Neverland. Peter nodded. He looked around and saw that he was very high above London and the Thames. It was lovely and big, and he looked back at Angela and noticed that the pirate ship was rather large and had two big sausage-shaped balloons attached to it. Balloons? Why not? He was always fond of balloons, and he thought that that might perhaps be the least odd thing he'd seen recently. They were very close, and he could see lots of people on the ship. Angela? Yes, Peter? She waved at the ship, and someone waved back. I hope you don't think me dreadfully rude, but I was hoping you wouldn't be offended if I started screaming right now. Angela giggled. He took that as an approval and started screaming, begging her indulgence. He threw up, too. Angela giggled some more. Peter was funny. And that brings us up to 9 o'clock. Let's see. Which pretty much winds up as much as I wanted to give away now. But I am going to be open to taking questions. And so I'm going to flip open a Facebook page, and I will be happy to take questions there. I don't know how many people are here in the chat. I hope I slow down enough. And so I'm going to go ahead and flip over to the Facebook, and I'll go ahead and take chats for like the next or questions for like the next half hour. I hope you guys have been enjoying it. And as you'll notice on the event page on Facebook, there is a link to a Kickstarter, which I'm trying to get to pay to have this edited, which runs about $800. So far, I've raised just under 50, but I've got like a couple weeks left. So hopefully people might, if you enjoyed the book, would like to see it in print, find out what's going on, and catch up on some of the stuff that we skipped over there. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that book, and I'll go ahead and leave this open as well and take questions there. Thank you guys for tuning in, and let me see. I'm going to see. Let's see. There we go. Have to multitask here. Let's see. Okay. If anybody has any questions, I will be happy to answer them. Let's see. Let's see. I don't see any questions coming out. Hopefully people will enjoyed it. Let's see. I'll hang out here for a while and see if anybody's asking anything. Let's see. Doesn't look like it. Sad face.